Let us talk about due process for migrants, particularly illegal aliens, including illegal aliens who've committed some horrific acts. Due process. Wasn't a lot of talk about due process when Dwight Eisenhower, about 70 years ago, was rounding up Mexican Americans, or Mexicans who were in America, 1.3 million of them, and in 6 months' period of time, the military removed them from the country. Not a lot of talk about due process. Just making a point. But they tell us Donald Trump is creating a constitutional crisis, that Donald Trump isn't honoring the decisions of the courts. More on that in a moment. But that's not the case I want to discuss with you. I want to discuss with you the 1944 case of Korematsu versus United States. You've heard me reference this over the years. You've heard me talk about it, but I want to give it a little bit more of a thorough review. What does that have to do with everything? It has everything to do with everything. And actually, as I was reading about it over the last few hours to try and find a nice, concise summary for you, I was shocked to see that Wikipedia actually did a good job. You know, they hate my guts and write nasty stuff about me. Very dishonest. But here they were very honest. This was a case in 1944, a landmark decision by the Supreme Court that upheld the internment of Japanese Americans and Americans of Japanese descent from the West Coast. They set up military areas during World War II. And they rounded up and shipped out of California, mostly, but the West Coast, excuse me, Japanese Americans. There's no due process. They weren't accused of anything. They just looked different, and they were Japanese. And that's the truth. In the aftermath of Imperial Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, they write, President Franklin Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066. It was actually a military order. 9066. On February 19, 1942, authorizing the U.S. War Department to create military areas for which any or all Americans might be excluded. These were internment camps. The Western Defense Command, a U.S. Army military command charged with coordinating the defense of the West Coast of the United States, ordered, quote, all persons of Japanese ancestry, including aliens and non-aliens, that includes citizens, to relocate to internment camps. But a 23-year-old Japanese-American man, Fred Korematsu, refused to leave the exclusion zone and instead challenged the order that grounds it violated the Fifth Amendment. Due process, equal protection. In a majority opinion joined by 5 other justices, Associate Justice Hugo Black, by the way, was the first of FDR's Supreme Court justices. He had been the lawyer for the Klan in Alabama for several years, but he was very outspoken and supportive of the FDR New Deal agenda. Hugo Black held that the need to protect against espionage by Japan outweighed the rights of Americans of Japanese ancestry. He wrote that Korematsu was not excluded from the military area because of hostility to his race, but rather because the properly constituted military authorities decided that the military urgency of the situation demanded that all citizens of Japanese ancestry be segregated from the West Coast during the war against Japan. But it wasn't racist, he says. Dissenting justices Frank Murphy, Robert Jackson, and Owen Roberts all criticized the exclusion as racially discriminatory. Murphy wrote the most aggressive dissent, said the exclusion of Japanese falls into the ugly abyss of racism and resembled the abhorrent and despicable treatment of minority groups by the dictatorial tyrannies which this nation is now pledged to destroy. The Korematsu opinion was the first instance in which the Supreme Court applied a rule that it created strict scrutiny to review racial discrimination. It's one of only a handful of cases in which the court held the government met its standard. Met the standard. So in the wake of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and the final report of the first Roberts Commission, FDR issued this military order authorizing the War Department to create these military areas to remove the Japanese and to provide for the necessary transport, lodging, feeding of persons dispatched from such areas. In March of 1942, the U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel John L. DeWitt, commander of the Western Defense Command, issued Public Proclamation Number 1, demarcating Western military areas. There were 10 of them, and the exclusion zones therein, directing it, quote, any Japanese, German, or Italian aliens, but overwhelmingly Japanese, and any person of Japanese ancestry to inform the U.S. Postal Service of any changes of residence. Further military areas and zones were demarcated in Public Proclamation Number 2. In the meantime, Secretary of War Henry Stimson mailed to Robert Reynolds, the House Speaker, Sam Rayburn, draft legislation authorizing the enforcement of the military order. In March, Congress had enacted the proposed legislation, which Roosevelt signed into law. So the Democrats controlled Congress. They signed it into law. In March 1942, Western Defense Command began issuing civilian exclusion orders, commanding, quote, all persons of Japanese ancestry, including aliens and non-aliens, report to designated assembly points. And with the issuance of Civilian Restriction Order Number 1, Japanese Americans were forced to move to the relocation camps. Their homes were taken, their businesses were taken, their liberty was taken. But Fred Korematsu was 23-year-old Japanese American. He decided to stay at his residence in San Leandro, California, instead of obeying the order to relocate. He knowingly violated the act of the U.S. Army, even undergoing plastic surgery in an attempt to conceal his identity around his eyes and so forth. Korematsu argued that the Order 9066 violated the Fifth Amendment. Fifth Amendment was selected over the 14th Amendment due to the lack of federal protections of the 14th Amendment at the time. And he was arrested and convicted. Nobody ever raised any questions about his loyalty to the to the United States. The Court of Appeals in the Ninth Circuit eventually affirmed his conviction. And the Supreme Court granted certiorari, in other words, agreed to hear the case. And it was written by Hugo Black, found the case largely indistinguishable from a previous year's case. The same principle. He denied, did Black, that this had anything to do with race, when it had everything to do with race. Felix Frankfurter wrote his own opinion. He joined the majority, but he wrote his own opinion. And in his diaries, he reported that Justice Black told the justices as reason for deferring to the executive branch, somebody must run this war. It's either Roosevelt or us, and we can't do it. And while Korematsu is regularly described as upholding the internment of Japanese Americans, the majority opinion expressly declined to reach the issue of internment on the ground that Korematsu's conviction did not present that issue, which it said raised different questions. Of course, it did present that issue. That's exactly what it did. Now, Murphy's descent, he was a Michigander, for you Michiganders out there. He'd been mayor of Detroit. He'd been Attorney General of the United States. He was appointed by FDR. He said, I dissent, therefore, from this legislation of racism. Racial discrimination in any form and in any degree is no justifiable part whatever in our democratic way of life. It is unattractive in any setting. It's utterly revolting among who embrace the principles set forth in the Constitution of the United States. He goes on, all residents of this nation are kin in some way by blood or culture to a foreign land, yet they are primarily and necessarily a part of the new and distinct civilization of the United States. They must accordingly be treated at all times as the heirs of the American experiment and as entitled to all the rights and freedoms guaranteed by the Constitution. And there were two other justices, Jackson, who had been an attorney general and also been a prosecutor for the United States in the Nuremberg trials. He's quite a man, actually. Let's see here. I want to give credit where credit is due, but unfortunately they don't. In any event, so here you have American citizens being rounded up by the military and sent to internment camps at the direction of Franklin Roosevelt for purely racist reasons. We have Donald Trump, who is trying to deport under existing immigration law gang members, terrorists, criminals, or just people who have violated our immigration laws. Not American citizens, not because of race, creed, color, sex. Joe Biden let millions of people into this country illegally. Now we're being told that each and every one of them has a court hearing and due process of some sort. Each and every one of them. You know, we've talked about Cloward and Piven. You remember Cloward and Piven? Glenn Beck used to talk about it too a lot. Cloward and Piven, they were two Marxists. I think they were either psychologists or social workers or something of that sort. But professors. And they wrote their book, it was in the 60s, became more famous in the 70s, that you need to overwhelm the system. It was about welfare specifically at the time, but it grew to a bigger concept. Overwhelm it and destroy it, and that way you create uprisings, you create revolutions, you create dissent, you stir the pot. So use the system against the system. And they were focused on welfare. But now, you see, ladies and gentlemen, let's focus on immigration. So Biden opens the door to all these illegal immigrants, millions of them. And now we're told that the only way to remove them is for each and every one of them to have some kind of notice and hearing. I see this in the pages of National Review, which is truly pathetic and sad. Because what I know, what these progressive judges that Schumer made sure got appointed knows, what we all know is we don't have enough administrative law judges, enough federal judges, to give each person a habeas or some kind of due process hearing. It's not possible. That's number one. Number two, even in cases where they have a right to such a hearing, where they're claiming amnesty, they come into the country because they fear for their lives, many of them never show up. They disappear. 95% of them don't go to their court hearings. And then lastly, the vast majority of people who come into this country illegally don't go to any court. They just disappear into society. And so this whole idea that there should be due process hearings of some kind, it's not about due process. I don't care how many former federal prosecutors wring their hands. This is about Cloward and Piven, overwhelming the system, making sure these people stay no matter what. So Biden let people come in mass by the millions. By the millions. And now we're supposed to take each one at a time and go through and make sure they have some kind of due process hearing.